You need to hear this if you're following Germany's stance on immigration. Big changes are on the horizon. After facing electoral challenges, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is tightening the reins on migration. Moving away from Angela Merkel's welcome culture, Scholz is expediting deportations, reinforcing border controls, and working closely with countries of origin. This shift responds to rising public concerns and the influence of the far-right AfD party. Left-leaning parties across Europe are feeling the pressure, trying to balance public anxieties with humanitarian principles. Germany's new approach includes stricter border measures, quicker deportations, and efforts to improve integration. The public remains divided. Some support accepting refugees, while others worry about uncontrolled immigration. Will Germany's policy shift address these concerns? Only time will tell. Stay tuned to find out more.
Welcome to Germany! Look at these smiles.
These were images we had never seen before.
Germany and Austria welcomed thousands of refugees and migrants with open arms.
Tens of thousands of refugees arriving in Germany by train as they were cheered on by crowds of volunteers. In 2015, a third of refugees went to Germany. The following year, this was 60%. But there is now a second wave of migration without taking Ukrainian refugees into account. If we add these figures, the numbers will exceed that of the migrant crisis, and once again, Germany is taking the largest share. Germany is now the largest refugee-hosting country in the EU and the third largest in the world. 27% of the German population has a migration background, and in some cities like Offenbach, nearly half the residents don't have a German passport. But this second crisis is different. It is happening after 2 difficult years of suffering through the pandemic, and after the war in Ukraine made everything from gas to food much more expensive. How has the first migrant crisis affected crime rates, the economy, and Germany as a whole? And how is this second crisis related to recent protests that amassed over 1 million people? This is Germany's migrant crisis.
Extraordinary scenes, extraordinary. People handing them water. Welcome to Germany!
These images were broadcasted live around the world. Conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East forced millions on the move. Germany had taken in waves of migrants before. In the 1950s and 60s, their economy was experiencing rapid growth, and they made deals with primarily Turkey to recruit large numbers of workers and their families to solve a considerable shortage of workers. Later in the 1980s and 90s, there was a considerable influx of refugees, and Germany's handling of these asylum seekers was very poor. They often lived in deplorable conditions, causing friction with local residents. But complaints about these refugees were often ignored, and this situation escalated into large-scale rioting. Mobs of neo-Nazis attacked refugee communities, often with hundreds to thousands of local residents cheering them on. These images spread across Germany and were a wake-up call for many. These riots resulted in large-scale demonstrations against racism. This history at least partly explains why Germans in 2015 were exceptionally willing to welcome refugees, but it simultaneously led to a growing number of Germans who were worried about their country's migration policy. Merkel's decision was partly ideological, but she also envisioned that these refugees would solve a more practical problem. Germany's population is aging, and their workforce is shrinking. Official figures show that Germany's workforce is expected to shrink with 4.4 million by 2040, and this is in part due to low birth rates. It has become common for women to work over having children, and this contributed to birth rates to reach a historic low in 2011. On top of this, the baby boomers from the 1950s and 60s were now entering retirement, adding a costly expense to the German society. With these trends, Germany would need 400,000 immigrants per year to prevent the population from shrinking.
Und ich sage ganz einfach, Deutschland ist ein starkes Land. Wir haben so vieles geschafft, wir schaffen das.
Wir schaffen das became her mantra. And so began Germany's exceptional intake of refugees. In 2015, they took in well over 440,000 refugees, which represents a third of all asylum seekers that year in Europe. The next year, they took 722,000, or about 60% of Europe's total. This strategy has a name: replacement migration. The theory that migration is needed for a region to achieve a particular demographic, economic, or social goal. This concept often has the objective to avoid the decline of the total and working age population, and is often influenced by low birth rates. And German women have some of Europe's lowest, at only 1.3 per woman on average, whereas 2.1 is necessary to maintain the size of a population. Foreign-born women in Germany, however, have a higher birth rate at 1.8 on average. Today, nearly half the children under the age of 5 are first or second generation immigrants, setting Germany up for a future with a significantly higher share of residents with a migration background. This demographic shift was sudden and unexpected, and from the moment it started, a growing number of Germans were expressing concern, first primarily about whether Germany could handle such large numbers, and later increasingly about whether this demographic shift is desirable. This growing concern was amplified by the sexual assaults in Cologne during New Year's Eve in 2016.
Beneath the fireworks that lit up the German sky, hundreds of women were allegedly assaulted in Cologne on New Year's Eve.
A group of 20 or 30 men that just surrounded us. They touched us everywhere they could, between the legs and our breasts.
The victims say the attackers were of Arabic and North African appearance, fueling pre-existing tensions between Eastern and Western values and sexual attitudes.
And then after the terror attack in Bataclan and the truck rampage on Berlin's Christmas market.
Witnesses say the truck jumped a curb, barreled into the Christmas market crowd, and just kept going.
Even when these crimes weren't carried out by refugees who arrived in 2015, this contributed to a more widespread fear about how the government's migration policies were affecting the country.
Der dumme Deutsche, wird doch kein rassistischer Nazi sein und sein Erspartes diskriminierenderweise nicht herausgeben wollen für die ganze schöne, bunte Vielfalt.
In 2017, the newly formed Alternative for Germany, or AfD, ran on an anti-immigration agenda and out of nowhere became Germany's third biggest party.
Wir werden uns unser Land und unser Volk zurückholen.
For some, this wind of change felt like a victory, while others feared these developments.
Wir sind schockiert darüber. Katastrophe für diese Republik.
Während die AfD am Berliner Alexanderplatz ihr Wahlergebnis feiert, protestieren unten viele empörte Bürger.
But Germany was on the verge of a new crisis. The number of asylum seekers in Europe rose in 2022 and in 2023, of which Germany once again took the largest shares, albeit less than in 2015 and 2016. The numbers of detected illegal border crossings rose by 70%. Most refugees came from Syria, Afghanistan, and Turkey. And this increase was partly due to lax restrictions on the movement of people after the pandemic. On top of this, 4.2 million Ukrainians received temporary protection in the EU, and about a quarter of which was in Germany.
Germans welcoming displaced Ukrainians into their country.
Once again, an exceptional number of Germans showed a willingness to accommodate those seeking protection. But it coincided with a noticeable change in rhetoric about migration policy.
Es empört mich, wenn jemand schwerste Straftaten begeht, der hier bei uns Schutz gesucht hat. Solche Straftäter gehören abgeschoben, auch wenn sie aus Syrien und Afghanistan stammen.
Olaf Scholz was now Germany's chancellor, and as Vice-Chancellor and Minister of Finance under Merkel, he was partly responsible for the government's handling of the first migrant crisis.
Fast jeder Vierte in Deutschland hat einen Migrationshintergrund. Wir sind ein Einwanderungsland.
When Scholz took office, his approval rating was 65%, but this had lowered to 28% by June 2024. Official government figures show that the crime rate in Germany had risen by 6% compared to 2022, and authorities attributed this increase to higher levels of migration. While foreigners made up only 15% of the population, they accounted for 41% of all crimes in 2023. Following the attack from Hamas on Israel, there erupted celebrations in various neighborhoods across Germany, adding to a growing sense of incompatibility with the values of some migrant communities. A month later, in a hotel near Potsdam, a group of high-ranking politicians from AfD had a secret meeting with neo-Nazis to discuss the deportation of millions of people with a migration background. But they didn't know that a group of journalists had infiltrated the meeting, and in early January, they exposed their plans. More than 1 million people across the country took to the streets to protest. This was topped off by a series of violent attacks, of which some were politically motivated. There's a Portuguese proverb that says, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." But only in hindsight we can tell which intentions those are. Next year, there are federal elections in Germany, and migration is now a top issue for voters. 67% of people was worried about migration last year, and that is now up to 86%. The action or inaction from the government in the following months will likely influence how people will vote. At the time of writing, in July 2024, the headlines read, "Scholz vows to step up deportations," and he vows to deport criminals, and that he agreed to a historic, stricter migration policy. Scholz announced the long-awaited plans that were negotiated for many years. Asylum procedures will be sped up, social benefits restricted, and more funding will be made available for local communities. This came after his endorsement for a bill that deports foreigners who praise acts of terror, even if it's only on social media. For Scholz, a failure to implement more significant reforms might go down in history as the beginning of his political end. But there's also another side of this coin. Of the migrants who entered in 2015, the employment rate is now almost similar to that of other Germans, and these figures are improving with every passing year. Some studies show that immigration to the EU increased Germany's GDP by over 1% per year. These migrant communities have created a larger consumer pool and a higher demand for products. The policies of Merkel have been successful in the sense that they have achieved many of the goals that she set out to achieve. But whether these aims are desirable is subject to opinion. Germany is Europe's largest economy, and they're centrally located on the continent. How they choose to evolve their migration policy will not only influence them, but it will have a cascade effect across the continent.